Welcome back to Every Third House by Margery Frisbie. Chapter 11. Tracy felt silly with a down vest under her arm until she saw that Jan was wearing her regular down jacket. "You've got to be kidding," Tracy teased, climbing into Alan's back seat. "Haven't you noticed it's spring? The robins are pulling worms out of our back lawn." "You can laugh all you like," Jan held up her mittened hands. "I know about these early morning coot shoots. I've frozen while stalking the wild woodcock. If I can't stay in bed on Saturday morning, at least I can have some creature comforts." "You didn't have to come if you don't have any fun." Jan was trying to manoeuvre her binocular controls with her mittens on. "Oh, I do have fun. That's the point. I always have fun once we get started. I get warm too when the sun heaves itself out of bed. It's that first hour I'm preparing for this year, the one that makes you doubt your sanity." For just a second, Tracy thought about the persons in every third house doubting their sanity, but then she shook the association out of her head. She knew Jan didn't mean anything by her reference. "I'm simply too sensitive," Tracy chided herself. "What about you, Alan?" Jan called up to the front seat. "No jacket? Braving the cold to pursue the wild goose?" "Nah, I got my vest in the trunk. Why freeze? The birds don't hide if you dress warm." "How many kids did we end up with?" "About 11, and Mrs. Embry." "Mrs. Embry?" Tracy's surprise made her sound strangled. "There was some hitch at the last moment, and Embry said she would come," Jan explained. Alan smiled reminiscently. Must have been me telling her about that falcon in my driveway." As Alan switched on the turn signal, Tracy glanced to the right, past the entrance to the far end of the parking lot. She could see kids climbing out of a station wagon, staring up at the budding trees backlit against the striking blue sky. There were 2 other cars. Who drove beside Mrs. Embry? "I think Prescott. She came when we went to Lincoln Park, that sanctuary down by near the totem pole." Alan walked around the car, trying all the doors to make sure they were locked. "Last thing my father said," he explained to Tracy. "He's very particular about his baby." "Anyone for a cup of tea now, or shall we wait until we get back?" Mrs. Embry came up, waving her thermos. "Let's get hiking," Jan said. "I can see my breath. I'll get warm faster that way. On to the bird blind." Alan already had his binoculars fixed on a waving stork, a relic of the winter. "I think it's a song sparrow," he said. "What I want to see is a bluebird," Miss Prescott was saying as Tracy walked up. "They used to be all over here when I grew up." "Alan," she called, "find me a bluebird." "You'll need an orchard for that, Miss Prescott." "Isn't this an orchard? Crabtree Orchard?" Tracy heard Alan's, "Yeah, I guess you're right," and then a voice beside her asking, "How'd it go with your mother?" "Awful." Tracy didn't face Mrs. Embry. She pretended an interest in a raucous starling patrolling the parking lot. She'd said all she wanted to say about seeing her mother. Today was a day for ordinary birds, not for bats in the belfry. Mrs. Embry didn't seem to be satisfied. She fell in step with Tracy. How was the visit awful? Tracy felt pulled apart, like 2 halves of a popsicle breaking their close association. One part of her wanted to tell Mrs. Embry to get lost. The other half of her wanted to confess how bad it was, how her mother stared out the window, cut off from Tracy, cut off from life. I couldn't get through to her. She never did pay a lot of attention to what I had to say, ever. But it's worse now. There's this wall, net, empty place between us. I was mean to Grandma on the way home." "That doesn't sound like you." "I didn't plan to be. I told her I wasn't my mother's prettiest bloom, her posy." "That doesn't sound mean." "I meant it mean. I meant my mother couldn't focus on me, not that she ever has, and that my grandmother was silly sometimes." "How'd your grandmother take it?" Tracy could hear a plover going, "Kildee, Kildee," across the sky. She bounced right back. She's great at that. "Lucky for you," Mrs. Embry pointed her binoculars at a crabtree in flower at the edge of the meadow they were passing. "I wonder about that." "Ooh, I think it's some kind of warbler. Too hard to see with all those blossoms." "No," Tracy said. "About whether I'm lucky that she bounces back." "There she goes. Mrs. Embry raised her binoculars again. Sometimes I think not. Not what? Not a bird watcher? You haven't taken your binoculars out of your case. Not lucky to have a grandmother who bounces back. I suspect it's because she doesn't allow herself to get involved. She doesn't dig in any pits for fear she'll fall in. Mrs. Embry sat down on the cement bench along the path so she could balance her binoculars better. What does that do to you? She asked Tracy. Makes me very lonely. I've never admitted that before, Tracy realised. Lonely, Mrs. Embry picked up on the admission immediately. Yeah, there are the two of them, sitting over their tea, Grandpa doing his crosswords, Grandma sewing, and I'm alone in the bedroom with Mary Lincoln. Not the cheeriest of company, I should think. Tracy grinned ruefully. Miserable. But then misery loves company. You know, Tracy, you've got me doing it. Doing what? Reading about Mary Lincoln. I picked up Jim Bishop's book on the day Lincoln was shot last night at the library. All because of you. I found out she was proud and haughty, and that she had an astonishing memory for long classical poems, and that she wept hysterically, even when something was only mildly sad. Did he say anything about her mental state? Oh yes. Tracy noticed Mrs. Embry hesitate before she went on. She doesn't want to scare me, Tracy thought. She knows I'll compare Mary Lincoln to my mother. She had tantrums. She ruled her family by fear. I've read that too. Bishop said that later, when she got worse, Abraham Lincoln showed her the insane asylum out a White House window and warned her that if she didn't control her hallucinations, she would wind up there. Tracy could see the group ahead, turning into the blind overlooking the lake. We're going to miss the waterbirds, she thought. Why was it more important to her to talk about this woman, dead 100 years? Why was she hanging on to Mary Lincoln? Or was it the president she was hanging on to? That doesn't sound much like President Lincoln, she said to Mrs. Embry. No? Even he got to the end of his rope sometimes. Did you read how awful Mary Lincoln was to the tradesman delivering groceries to the White House? Somewhere, I think. A butcher complained to the president about Mary berating him. Poor old Abe told him that he ought to be able to stand for 15 minutes what he, Abe, had stood for 15 years. Poor guy. Yes, poor Abe, Mrs. Embry nodded, and poor Mary Lincoln too. Can you imagine how driven she must have felt? She was a smart woman. She must have seen how people reacted to her. You mean she couldn't help it? Tracy thought of her mother, listlessly staring out the hospital window, unable to show interest in her only daughter. I suppose that's what it means when we say somebody is mentally ill, that they can't help it. They are beyond saving themselves. And no one else can save them? Tracy shivered in spite of the sun now fully in charge of the eastern sky. I don't know what they could do in Mary Lincoln's day, how they treated her in the asylum, or what kind of therapy she got. But now there is certainly a lot a doctor can do. A small bird with a familiar black cap lighted on a bush across from the bench where Tracy and Mrs. Embry sat in the sunlight. Tracy was reminded of the chickadee at Hawthorne and Highland the morning her mother went into the hospital. It had had the same jaunty black cap. Neither she nor Mrs. Embry reached for binoculars for fear the bright beady eyes would pick up the movement. That's a funny chickadee, Tracy thought. Weren't they supposed to have more black on them someplace? Under the chin, maybe? She felt as if she were spying at a lunch counter as she watched the bird delicately examine the underside of a twig for delicacies, and then start climbing down the trunk of a tree, head first. What fun, Mrs. Embry whispered. A nuthatch. Tracy was glad she hadn't said chickadee out loud. Now she remembered chickadees had thicker bills, good for eating seeds. The nuthatch was a nimble clown, darting around the tree, rummaging for breakfast. Tracy was sorry when someone slamming a car door scared the performer. Maybe we should catch up with the others, Mrs. Embry said. Can't expect all the birds to put on their show for us personally. She looked around as if she were drinking in the freshness of the morning, storing it for the return to the classroom. It's all so beautiful, Mrs. Embry exulted. What was it Wordsworth said? No, Browning, I guess. God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. Whatever can she mean? Tracy thought frantically. Nothing is right with the world. A nuthatch makes everything all right. A lousy nuthatch? That was stupid. What about her mother? What about her father? What about her brother? She could feel those tears in her chest that hadn't flowed yesterday. Suddenly they were choking her, cracking her lungs, breaking her windpipe, pressing on her face, like hungry people scratching at doors where food is hidden. Was she going to feel like a thick-skinned balloon that can't deflate or inflate any further? Walk about the rest of her life on the verge of explosion? Then the torrent came. The sobs started in her toes and racked her body. She couldn't hear anything, couldn't feel anything but the waves of rolling contractions surging through her. Finally the tears broke out, a cascade of hot burning brine. They were a relief and a revolt, but they were not a remedy. It was as if there was no remedy, as if she could go on crying like this forever. Tracy turned her face to the back of the bench, holding on with one hand while the other searched her pockets for the tissue she'd stuffed away in case some spring pollen made her sneeze. Her back heaved and shifted, twisted as it was by her awkward position. She couldn't hear Mrs. Embry say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, so terribly sorry. How did I ever forget? It seemed such a moment." The waves pressing Tracy's body, squeezing tears from every cell in her body, pushing them into a top swell of grief, drove all thought from Tracy's head. She rode the waves, giving over any control, all control. She felt she'd kept her feelings padlocked for so long, abused them so fiercely, ignored their appeals so consistently, that she had lost any strength to continue their safekeeping. All's right with the world? Who was kidding who? Her feelings had been telling her there wasn't much right with it at all. What good was a nuthatch, a Canada goose, a song sparrow? This wasn't the real world. This was pretend. The real world was in that hospital, in her room, in her kitchen where she, Tracy, was now the outsider. Tracy's shoulders stopped shaking long enough for Mrs. Embry to put a hesitant hand on Tracy's shoulder. Finally Tracy could hear her. "Tracy, Tracy, Tracy, what can I do for you? I'm so sorry." There was no way Tracy could answer, even if she had anything to say. Her throat was closed by the force of her tears. The harpies inside her fed on her woe and worthlessness. Let us out, they clamoured, riding the wallowing waves of escaping tears. Mrs. Embry had her arm across Tracy's shoulder now. Although she couldn't stop crying, Tracy had begun to regain her faculties, to wonder what was happening to her. Why was she crying now? Why hadn't she cried in her room yesterday, all alone where no one would have known, where she could have pulled her comforter over her head and buried herself away from everybody? She remembered how prickly and dry she had felt, like a cactus no one ever watered, as if she could pierce through anything she touched. It was a terrible feeling, and this waterfall wasn't any better. Tracy wondered if she could ever stop, or whether she could cry out her insides like someone dying of lung disease. She could feel Mrs. Embry's hands firmly clenching her shoulders as if to control the engulfing waves. You'll never be able to, Tracy thought, but now she was aware of Mrs. Embry's worried voice. "Tracy, can you stop crying so? Everyone is coming." Tracy shook her head, the sobs still rising out of her gut, still enveloping her. There was no way now she would ever be able to stop. To stop meant that she would have to go back to thinking. She'd had enough of that. The sobs were her answer, her defence. Even so, she was aware suddenly of Alan's voice coming close, high-pitched, cocky from conquest. He must have seen something great, Tracy realised. Maybe that elusive woodcock we always meant to find together. Mrs. Embry's strong arms were lifting Tracy off the bench now, urging her down the path towards the parking lot. Tracy still heaved, but the tears were drying up. Her body had squeezed out all its juice. She was a dry husk like the milkweed seed pods hanging over from winter. "Walk slowly, Tracy," Mrs. Embry cautioned. "They've stopped to see something in that big oak. Keep going. I'll get you to my car." Slowly the convulsions subsided and Tracy could shake herself from Mrs. Embry's grip. She concentrated on putting one foot after the other. She had to get out of here. Get home. Then she wondered, home? Why home? She was afraid that the thought would burst the stopper in her throat again, but it wasn't so. There was nothing left to cry. Lots to cry about, Tracy added to herself, but nothing to cry with. Mrs. Embry had been talking to her, but Tracy couldn't fasten on the message. She watched Mrs. Embry's hands, saw her take out the car keys, put them in the lock of the passenger side, turn the key. Mrs. Embry opened the door. "Need any help?" she asked. Tracy shook her head. Now she'd cried, she wanted to hide, but it was too late. She was surrounded by a clutch of concerned faces and a chorus of questions. "Is Tracy sick? What happened? Is she hurt? We never should have left her. I thought she was with us until we got to the blind. Wasn't she with Mrs. Embry?" Tracy had climbed in the front seat. No one had closed the door. She wanted to tell them she was all right, but she wasn't all right. At least she could say it wasn't their fault. But she didn't think she could ever say anything without starting that painful bawling again. She was too beat to chance that. Until next time, good night.